Hey, welcome to episode 8 of 25 levels of cutting boards. So sorry for the delay, but I've had to do some 18-hour days between keeping up with the orders, managing the Christmas market during the day, and trying to work on these two boards with late suppliers for the wood, but I can finally upload one last episode before Christmas, and I will be back with the next one in January because I deserve some holidays too. What you're seeing here is a 3D printing of a triangular clamping system I designed, whose files will be in the description below, and it required a bit of post-processing, such as tapping the screw holes to get nice results. I'm also adding the SolidWorks files for those who want to modify it to suit your project, as well as a step file. I started this board out by preparing some ash, Paduke, and Sapelli blocks from lumber that I had left. This one is simple to prepare because all the blocks are identical, but here comes the difficulty. If you want to sand them properly and then glue them, you need some tools that don't exist. So I started out by making a jig for sanding triangular blocks by gluing some extra blocks I had with some ash blocks to raise them, and then screwed that together before screwing everything to a base while keeping everything aligned in parallel thanks to a central part that I cut from MDF. When it was time to glue up the parts together, I used my homemade triangular clamps and made 8 triangular blocks. Now here's where stupid me messed up. I thought there were only 2 possible configurations for the layout, so I could always do a symmetry by flipping the block. But it turns out there were 4 possible configurations, and I ended up having 3 and 5 of each instead of 8 identical blocks. So at this point I also noticed the only way to make the board square was to make multiples of 6, but I'll explain that in a second, so I created one more of the second configuration. Then I sanded down the triangular blocks using the jig and the drum sander, and then moved on to the glue up. Now this glue up was a challenge because since the different blocks are triangular, it's much harder to get a 4-direction clamping pressure to make sure everything is flat and aligned, and those triangular parts really want to move around. Now I can finally explain what I said earlier about making multiples of 3. I cut the excess off on one side of the final block and had to do 2 passes because it was too thick. And once that was finished, and sorry for the focus here, but I could finally take the excess from one side and glue it on the other side. And the only way for everything to match up is to have a multiple of 3 triangles to make up the block. So finally I passed the blocks through the drum sander and trimmed the excess off on the table saw and then cut strips to get my end grain pattern. Once glued, I trimmed the board on all sides and sanded it down before adding screw holes and a juice groove. And believe it or not, this is the last juice groove of the series. I've decided to avoid putting some on the rest of the board, so you won't hear me say, I made a CNC juice groove anymore. Then I added some linseed oil to protect the board and some rubber feet for adherence, and the final result is a really cool board with a hexagonal base pattern that I think looks really great. Now moving on to the second and last board of this episode, which I think in retrospect might need to be placed higher in the difficulty rating. This is the Feldthouse weave invented by Ryan Feldthouse. Now I didn't get his manual, I'm not gonna lie, because I just prefer learning by myself and making mistakes to make sure I don't make them twice. In this case, I'm pretty sure I reached a point psychologically where I was questioning my philosophy on learning, because this board is summarized by 15 hours of frustration, but it's extremely rewarding. Now just to give you an idea, it may seem like I'm just doing a few cuts because I don't want this video to become less interesting, but overall, just cutting the lumber down, adjusting every single piece to the right thickness, right down to the 1/10 of a millimeter in all directions, took a humble 6 hours. That's right, 6 hours. And yeah, cutting strips like that makes a huge mess. This one is one of the boards that's only half present when you cut on it because the other half is in a vacuum cleaner. But hey, at least those strips look sexy as hell. I'm talking all 126 of them. Come to think of it, that's only 2.8 minutes per strip. Now once that was done, I went on to the glue up, which, believe it or not, took another 3 hours because it's a nightmare to prepare. I attempted to glue up with rubber bands, but it wasn't tight enough, so I added clamps and MDF blocks around it, which was so much more efficient that I ended up wiping away the Rio Grande equivalent in wood glue. I then unclamped after about an hour and everything was fine, but it turns out the wood glue doesn't like me very much, and I woke up to this nightmare hours later. I actually had to scrape some out of there and re-glue everything much tighter to compress what was left of uncured glue and fix my mistake. Thankfully, clamping clamps down with clamps that were clamped down with clamps allowed me to have just enough pressure to fix my mistake. Hell, I still can't believe that actually worked. It's crazy the things you can do when you're losing your sanity. Now, once the horribly frustrating part was complete, I went on to the next part of the build, which was to prepare the final blocks. I started by planing down the blocks I glued and then used my table saw to cut 3/4 of all the cuts to make the square a 45-degree square. and completed the last cut using the table saw again, but at a 0-degree angle. I used the scraps for another board I will show you at the end, which looks really cool because the scraps weren't that precise at all. For those who have been subscribed for over 2 years, I basically fissured that block of wood. Now once that was done, I finally glued up everything together to get the board I needed for the crosscuts. I planed that board down and started cross-cutting it on the table saw with my sled and arranged it for glue up, gluing it with Tide Bond 3 as always. The finishing touches were the sanding, using a drum sander and my brand new dual mode sander, which is absolutely life-changing. I sanded for a little over 20 minutes instead of the usual hour and a half for everything. Then I thought to myself, I should probably avoid adding a chamfer just in case I get a tear out and ruin the board. But you know what, chamfers are cool and serve as handles, so let's make some and... oh, right, tear out. Needless to say, I had to add a piece of Fadook to fix that and it turned out looking great, but it was still a big risk. Finally, I added some hole for the feet and oiled the board, and the result is so worth the frustration. Granted, it was 15 hours of work, 2 of which could have been avoided, but I love this board. Now before you go, I want to show you the 3 boards, including the scrap board, and ask you to please share this video and comment something down below if you liked it, because this is a huge amount of work, not just woodworking, but filming and editing too, and I spent over 30 hours just to get everything presentable and explained, so I would really appreciate the support, because I'm really hoping to get this channel verified and make a living from it, and make higher quality videos too. Before my unemployment checks run out, of course. So thanks for sticking with me and wasting 2 Arial 11 word pages worth of listening, and I really hope to see you all in the next and final episode of the series. P.S. If I end up in a mental institute before then, send me a letter, will you?